Hey folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, where we talk exclusively about the Fab Four here on the show. And true to my word, our recent guest has returned, Eoghan Lyng. He is a music journalist who's written for a lot of different publications, record collector, We Are Cult, most recently Culture Sonar. And the reason that we're having him on this time is because he's just released a brand new book on George Harrison, called George Harrison in the 70s and decades on top here. So once again, Eoghan, welcome back to our channel.
Hello, yes. So not the most exciting or vibrant of titles, but it gets the message across as to what the era and what we're talking about. So we're talking about George Harrison from 1970 to 1979.
So an obvious question to start, why did you only want to cover the 70s with George? Why not do something on his entire solo career?
Excellent question. Before I get to that, I might as well tell the viewers, I'm actually in Spain on my holiday, so I'm doing this from my phone, and that might explain for the smaller screen. Just putting that out there. And that's why I'm so pink today, because I'm in Barcelona and it was 35 degrees and I may have caught a little bit of sunburn. But why about George Harrison in the 70s? That's a very good question. It's the Sonic Bond books like to do a series on a decade, the decade series, as you've said. And I wanted to write one about a Beatle during the 1970s. And it was during a discussion I had with Adrian Sinclair, who's the co-writer of what's going to be the Tolstoy of McCartney literature, McCartney Legacy. He said, why not do George? The music's fantastic, and he's nowhere near as written about as John or Paul. And I'd already written the piece on Extra Texture that we did a show on. I did the piece on Dark Horse that we did a show on. And the piece is just felt like, yeah, I could see the story unfolding in my head. So I decided in December 2020, with another year of the pandemic, that this is what I was going to focus my attentions on.
And just out of curiosity, not as if this matters, is George your favorite Beatle when it comes to his music?
As a person, I would say yes. He's the one I kind of feel a kindred spirit to. I mean, I'll always think that that Paul was the best from an artistic and a compositional point of view, but as a person, I think the one I would have liked to have had a beer with, or maybe meditate with, or have a conversation with. I wish I could have interviewed George Harrison, because whether he was grumpy, effervescent, you always got solid gold from the man. Yeah,
you could say the same thing about John. John was very moody. There were times when he could be, very bitter, you know, and then he could be very warm and loving. You just don't know with someone like him. He's always engaging no matter what. So, yeah.
Yeah, I do think George's were a bit more lucid, and definitely he seemed to know what he was talking about, whereas often John Lennon didn't. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We could save that for another show, I think. So I'm going to be quoting you a lot from things that you put in your book, and some of your passages I'm actually going to read because they're so eloquently written that I definitely think there's no better way to say it than the way you said it in the book. Early on, you said George was the most chameleonic of the Beatles. Why would you say that?
Well, because he was the one who had the widest berth of influences. He was the one who brought, Indian music to the Beatles, synthesizers on the Abbey Road album. He's invested in country and Western. He's just got this incredible display of music. Lennon could be chameleonic, but he loved to stick to the rockers. Paul flitted between his favorite genres, and Ringo mainly stuck to country, but there's just a huge tapestry of influences to George's work.
I actually misunderstood what you meant. I thought you meant personality-wise.
Again, yeah, I mean, malleable. He was an actor, a producer, a writer, a poet. Great, very meditative. Just an incredible guy all around.
Okay. When it comes to music, I would think that no one's more diverse than McCartney is. but that could be another conversation.
Probably.
Yeah, I want to read a few things here. First of all, page 17, you wrote, "It's easy to romanticize the end of the Beatles as some Shakespearean tragedy, but the breakup was ultimately one of growth and not of spite." I think that was really well said right there.
Well, thank you. Yeah, but it's true. I mean, we like to see 1970 as the winter of discontent, and when really it's just four men hitting into their 30s. I'm turning 30 next year, so I can relate a little bit, and just moving on with their lives.
Just out of curiosity, we're going off here a little bit, because somewhere early on you're talking about the Get Back, Let It Be sessions as a depressing time, sessions wise. Did the Get Back documentary change your opinion of that?
Not well, from George's point of view, definitely not. He still storms out, and you can definitely see in the first episode that there are times he's deeply unhappy. I mean, he plays the lick to every little thing, and very quickly the other guys are saying, "Nah, we won't do that one." And you can see that he's trying to chip in, and they just keep rubbishing his ideas. It's not as bad as maybe he may have remembered it, but you can see that he's a bit frustrated, that he's in the corner playing guitar, and the other three are hogging the cameras. And yeah, he's just come from America, where he was writing with Robbie Robertson and Bob Dylan, and I think that's where his heart was.
Well, from the perspective of Twickenham, yes, I could see what you're saying. But then once they went over to Apple Studios, at least based on what they showed in the documentary, it was a very different atmosphere, much looser. They were more together, more cohesive as a unit, really into it. I think so, anyway.
But I mean, there's also that telling moment when McCartney leaves the studio and George Harrison admits to John Yoko, "I'm thinking of doing an album because it's the only way to get my songs out there." I think that's a pretty telling insight into that whether or not the Beatles were going to continue, he was going to release All Things Must Pass in one way or another.
It's interesting. You can interpret things so many different ways. The more that I study this era, it seems to me that George saw the value in the Beatles continuing.
Yeah.
He knew how great they were, the chemistry of the four of them. He wanted that to continue, but at the same time, he was starting to think, maybe I can have both a solo career and continue with the group. Yeah.
I mean, I agree with Mark Lewison's philosophy that the Beatles only end when John Lennon makes that decision flying back from Canada that he just wants out. Before that, I think that's the moment when I think that's the moment where it ends. And I mean, I've had some heated discussions with some people. I mean, Diana Erickson and I have had some very strong arguments over this, but I just think it's that matter of fact that John Lennon just says, "I don't need these guys anymore," and that's it.
And there are some people who think that John changes his mind so often that maybe this was something that he felt at that moment and he could change his mind. And
I don't think so. I think he gets to Toronto, he's having a blast, and he just thinks, "I don't want to do this anymore. I'm really not interested in Paul and George's works. I just want to do my own thing." As in, he respected them as musicians, but he just felt like, I mean, it's a bit like Sting in '85. He just thinks, "I don't need Stewart and Andy Summers anymore. I mean, I can just do it by myself."
Yeah, I see your point. There's a lot of reasons, I believe, why the Beatles broke up, but whether or not people agree with me, to me, the biggest reason is because John wanted to have a life with Yoko and explore artistically, what he could do with her and on his own.
Yep, I agree. I think that even in the Get Back series, you can see that she excites him in a way that, like he says, I'd murder you all for her, or whatever it is. But I mean, and there's that wonderful bit at the beginning of the second episode where Paul and Ringo are in tears because they know that John he's out with Yoko, and this is probably it. It's that moment that they're accepting it. I mean, Paul looks like my parents did when they realized I was going off to college in Cork and I was leaving, and that kind of that baby son was moving on with his life.
Right. Yeah. No doubt about it. That documentary is fascinating to watch, and it's just so great that we have
Yeah.
almost 8 hours of it. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
I also want to commend you for putting this quote in from Klaus Vormann. There's some great quotes from Klaus in your book.
Oh, incredible. Yeah.
Klaus said in the year 2020, those 10 years that they were together, those 10 years were more than enough. Ringo would have stayed with the band. He loved everybody. But the rest, there was lots of anger, fights. They couldn't have done it any longer because they were all in completely different directions. Abbey Road, it's a beautiful album, but from a feeling point of view, it wasn't right to do it. They had to do it because they had obligations to the record company, but they did it really professional and fantastic. And that's what makes a good band, Very interesting to put that in there. Where did you say this? Do you remember?
Oh, it was it's either GQ or Esquire or one of these magazines. I'll find it. I can link it to you. But no, I was very I found that quote and I went, that's it. That's it. That it's going in.
Yeah. For someone that close to the Beatles to say that they shouldn't have made Abbey Road, that was startling for me.
Okay, yeah. I'm not sure I agree with him by saying when he says Abbey Road was an obligation. I think that clearly there's photos of Paul and George having an absolute blast during that time. So I'm not sure when Lennon returns to the sessions after his accident in Scotland, he's also having a whale of a time. I think they all sort of knew this was probably it. Even though there is that meeting in 1969 where John Lennon is talking about the next album and suggesting that they individualize the credits. But I think deep down they all probably knew this was it.
That was right before they went to Toronto.
Yeah. As I say, that's what I think. I think Toronto, he has a blast. He goes over to there. He's got Clapton in there, Alan White. I was very fortunate to interview Alan White before he died.
Me too.
And yeah, indeed. And I think he just thinks, I just don't need the Beatles anymore. And that's it.
All right. You say here McCartney may have underestimated Harrison's songwriting abilities, but Bob Dylan didn't. Yeah. Now, why do you single out McCartney and not Lennon? It was Lennon who apparently Lennon turned down Isn't It a Pity? Which, from what we've heard, George had written. I don't know if he completely wrote it, but around the time of Revolver. How do you know that John wasn't rejecting George's songs?
I think there's a case to be made there. That is but the McCartney comment is in direct correlation to the quote that came out in 2019 that he says, before this album, I didn't think George's songs were very good, which he says on tape. So that's, I mean, and Paul was getting a lot of critic flack on social media in 2019 for that off the cuff comment, because they said, what about Taxman or Within You Without You or Long Long Long, which are like Long 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 is my personal favorite song on the White Album. I just think it's so beautiful, and Paul plays this haunting organ and he doesn't think that's a good song, or he sings backing vocals on The Inner Light. He said that was a beautiful melody, but 1 year later he's saying that's not a good song, that it's not until Something and Here Comes the Sun that he doesn't think George's songs were very good.
He actually says in that meeting in September of '69, when they're talking about their next album after Abbey Road, that he thinks maybe his songs aren't as good as his and John's, and George is saying, I don't know, I think I have my fan base. There are fans that like some of my songs. So, but at the same time, you can make the argument that for whatever the reason, John didn't play on a lot of George's stuff towards the end, and Paul was always there for George.
Yeah. 100%. And Paul, some of his best bass work, some beautiful piano, some incredible harmony vocals. I mean, the harmony on Something. I interviewed Jerry McAvoy, who was Rory Gallagher's bassist last year, and he said he singled out Something as just one of his favorite bass lines. He called it like a melody unto itself. I'm You can read that on Penny Black. I'm enormously proud of the interview I did with Jerry McAvoy.
Okay.
It's a dialogue between two Irish guys talking about how Ireland has changed since the 1970s.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And George himself said that he thought that the bass line on something was too busy.
I know, what a weird thing to say. Yeah. But as Paul said in later years, why didn't if he did think that, why didn't he just say it's too busy? I want a simpler bass line.
I don't know. Sometimes I get the feeling that one of the biggest problems the Beatles had was that they just didn't communicate with each other. They kept their feelings in.
Yeah.
John would lash out to the media about problems with Paul. Maybe he didn't come right out and say it to Paul.
Yeah, I think there's a very good argument to be made there. You got to remember, this was 1960s Britain, that people just didn't talk about their emotions. We keep this all bottled in. I mean, John Cleese in the 1970s took up therapy, and he was getting John Cleese from Monty Python and Fawlty Towers, and people in the British media were sneering at John Cleese for, what a wimp getting therapy. These days, everyone's getting therapy these days. Everyone sees it as an investment. But not back then.
Hey, it's frightening to think of how revealing John was about himself, him and Yoko. I mean, it's like what he's saying in his interviews at times was, like we're his psychologists and he's telling us everything. Very deep personal stuff. And Yoko too. So anyway,
I agree. Yeah.
Let me read something here about All Things Must Pass, about the album. The standard of material was never in doubt, but it was the album's shimmering production style that ensured its success with a transatlantic public. Between the chiming guitars, angelic backing vocals, and aphorisms came a monolithic soundscape that served as much as an identity as it did another instrument. Together, Harrison and Spector made a great team, and in their combined efforts, they crafted a work that was tight, punchy, yet unrelenting in its resolve. It was Spector who encouraged Harrison to pursue the huge, spacious sound that laced the work, culminating in a triple record that sounded incredible in execution and piercing in ambition. I'm happy to see anybody defend Phil Spector these days. So
yeah. I mean, I do. At the end of the book, I do bring up, the crime and that quote from Ronnie Spector that he was quite a horrible man in real life. But as a musician, as a producer, he really was one of the greats. Yeah. I feel similarly conflicted about Roman Polanski. He's one of my favorite filmmakers, but he's a piece of work.
But you can separate the personal life from the professional.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I mean, Harvey Weinstein is a little different, but even then, I would say that, like Weinstein, it does sound like the guy, like, although he's an appalling man, he did also know when he could see a good movie, when he saw like a wonderful movie out of Cinema Paradiso, and he edited it into this kind of magic realism, and which was rubbish by the director, and he released a director's cut that was full of like superfluous, nonsensical moments that didn't really add to the film. So I mean, unfortunately, while a lot of these people are horrible in real life, there is something about their artistry. The one I won't go with is Motley Crue, because they're just crap musicians as well as horrible guys.
Okay, it's going a little bit off the subject, but as someone who always, it's become like a mantra for me. To me, the song is always more important than the production.
Yeah.
You still have to admit that part of the success of All Things Must Pass was what Phil Spector brought to it. The same way, even though I can tell from this book you're not a fan of Cloud Nine as an album, Jeff Lynne's production had a lot to do with its success. So still, 100%. the song comes first to me. It has to be strong material, but to have that ambiance on the record, to sound like you were in a cathedral or something for certain songs, that really added so much, to have that kind of ambiance on the record. I can't picture My Sweet Lord any other way than the way it sounds. or All Things Must
Exactly.
Pass, or Hear Me, Lord, or any of those songs, anything that's spiritual, it works with that kind of production technique added to it.
100%, 1,000%. Another one I would add to that list is Nigel Godrich, who produced Chaos and Creation, which is
Sure.
a very sophisticated sounding album, and it really allowed Paul to sing from the bottom of his gut at that time when he was undergoing a divorce or separation from Heather Mills.
That had more of a pure McCartney sound, more of a simple sound, raw, not as layered, and more of the 70s sound, early 70s especially.
100%, yeah.
I do like the fact that you bring up that All Things Must Pass, the song, works as a poem all by itself.
That's pretty good. I'd forgotten I said that.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff you put into this book. I like a lot of your observations, although some of them that I'll mention, I think, are very provocative, that will shock a lot of people. About the art of dying, you wrote, chiming perfectly with the rise of British metal. I don't know if I ever credited it with British metal. You said Harrison has been toying with the numbers since 1966, although he had delayed recording and releasing the song, fearing it was that bit too far out for public consumption. How do you know that?
Because he said that himself in an interview.
Okay. I'd like to read
that. He said that himself, that there is an interview of him where in the late 60s or in the early 1970s where he just thinks it's maybe a bit too out there. Because it is very freak out, and the lyrics, which is about enjoying the aspect of death. It's very Johnny Mandel from the theme from MASH, and not something we necessarily play on a Sunday morning.
Yeah. It's funny because on one of my podcasts on Things We Said Today, we talked about this, I believe, the art of dying, and on Revolver, and the song was written around the time of Revolver, here's John Lennon saying, I know what it's like to be dead. So it's not too far removed from that.
I don't know what I can add to that. For the rise of heavy metal, it was a time of, say, Zeppelin, Hendrix, Judas Priest, Black Sabbath being a huge one. And it is a fairly kind of like metally track with, those thunderous drums and that barreling, sparky riff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Those are your ears and what you're hearing, but I'll try to apply
it. Reminds me of that track, Crazy Horses.
Oh, the Osmonds.
Yeah. Crazy Horses. Yeah. Crazy Horses.
So you call that heavy metal?
Well, yeah, they apparently they were somewhere in Europe, and they could see all these people, dressed in blacks, and they were like, okay, a 14-minute version of Crazy Horses. Crazy.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't necessarily think Led Zeppelin are heavy metal, but people could classify them under that banner.
All right. So I could see what you're saying. Interesting. You bring up the Imagine album, and you wrote about Give Me Some Truth.
Yeah.
Say Give Me Some Truth was ultimately wasted among a series of ill thought out compositions, which earmarked the first of a trilogy of Lennon albums that did little to live up to his legend. Wow. I think Imagine's a classic, and I know you're not fond of the Mind Games album, which is my favorite Lennon album. Yeah. And I know a lot of people usually look at Sometime in New York City as, the weakest of the original material albums of his. But Imagine is generally recognized as a classic. The album.
Alan White, when I interviewed the late Alan White, said it's one of the best albums I think he called it one of the best albums he's ever played on. Recently, in one of the last pieces I wrote for Far Out magazine, I was on the team for 6 months. I wrote disappointing sophomore albums, and I put the Imagine album in there. And my two close Beatle fans of mine were like, we're going to fall out over this. Yeah.
So why do you think there were ill thought out compositions? Even just like Imagine. I mean,
yeah,
it's brilliant songs on there. Jealous
some
Guy.
brilliant songs.
How is, I think,
That's
one
a
of
nice
the most underrated of John's solo songs. I love How. Oh My
yeah,
Love is beautiful. How Do You Sleep?
yeah, I'll give you
Obviously, you know, very
That's a
biting
horrible
song.
track.
And
That's a horrible track. That's a horrible track.
why?
Because it's nasty. It just sounds nasty. It's pugnacious. It's very I faked every orgasms. It's nowhere near as clever as a wah wah or a Three Legs, or it's just dirty. I feel unclean when I hear it.
John is spilling his guts there. You know, he's telling it like it is, how he feels. And of course, John could also in interviews say, well, it's also about myself.
Oh, come on.
I know that, but we all know who it's directed towards. But still, lyrically, even though I think it's sad that he felt the way he did, the way that he expressed it, I think was brilliant. I don't agree with him, but he has a right to say what he wanted to say at the time.
Very true. I mean, I Don't Want to Be a Soldier, Mama. I don't think that's a very good song either. It's just, long and swampy, and it doesn't really say anything. It's a real. I mean, yeah.
It became a very free-form song. There's a lot of takes of that song where there's different arrangements to it, like a reggae arrangement. You could easily look at it as being something more in a blues and jazz vein, and a lot of improvising throughout. So
yeah, maybe
that's a song that took me a long time for me to come around to. Now I really appreciate it because it's not like most of John's more commercial stuff.
Maybe I need to re-listen into it. Yeah. You mentioned How. I like it as a song, but again, like The Long and Winding Road, I think the strings and the brass are just overbearing. I don't think it suited that song. It's a very humble song, and it's got this braggadocious backdrop, and I think it spoils it for me.
Okay, well, we can disagree. Hey, I want people on my channel that have different points of view from my own. We can all learn from each other. We don't have to agree with everything, but no, I think How is one of the most underrated songs of his solo career. And the Mind Games album has such gems on there. I mean, Out the Blue.
The title track's gorgeous.
Yep. I Know, I think is fantastic. You Are Here is gorgeous.
Yeah.
Love the rock, the edge of Meat City. It's a lot of great stuff on Mind Games. I don't see how anyone could. I mean, if you like Imagine and Plastic Ono Band more, that's fine, but I wouldn't consider it ill thought out compositions.
Maybe. I don't understand how anyone could rubbish, say, Red Rose Speedway, but people do. So
okay, we all have different tastes. That's all.
Yeah.
You mentioned that George had already begun working on Badfinger's No Dice album before he had to work on the concert for Bangladesh. You really meant Straight Up, right?
Oh God! Oh no!
Tell the publisher.
Thanks for pointing.
Have to make a correction.
You're own. Oh no! Oh no! Thanks for pointing that.
It's okay.
It's the same with. It's the same with the U2 book. Before I wrote this book, I wrote a book on the band U2, and I got a lot of mail from people saying, "Good book, but you forgot about the Japanese B-side, and you forgot about this live cover, and you didn't really say anything about their cover of Wild Horses," and it's like,
was it supposed to be comprehensive?
I don't know. The Sonic Bong series, they're written quite quickly, so unfortunately some gaps come in. So I will take this to apologize for getting the wrong album on that. I know. But in my defense, I mean, Philip Norman's, have you read his book on McCartney? It's filled with gaffes.
I read it. I wasn't that impressed.
Okay. I mean, he said that Paul McCartney was 30 in 1970. He wasn't even 28 when the Beatles broke up, and he did that, you know. So I mean, but thank you for pointing that out. Oh God.
You know, as far as what you just said about Philip Norman, there are certain things you should know without even doing the research. You should know Paul's birthday. You should know when he was born.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Interesting what you said concerning the concert for Bangladesh. You said the Ravi Shankar piece, Bangla Done. Listening to the sitar suite in 2021, it holds up exceptionally well, offering the album a timelessness the turbocharged rock numbers did not.
Yeah.
You don't
Well, I
find
mean,
that the rock songs on the concert for Bangladesh have held up?
I think they hold up, but they're very much from. I don't think they're timeless. They're very much centered in the 1970s. I love Led Zeppelin, but Stairway to Heaven smacks of 1971. Like it could not have been in any other decade. That's just worse. Like you listen to the sitar suites, it could be they could play it now, it would still sound timeless. That's all I meant. But I mean, they sound great, but it sounds 1970s. It's very, you know, bravura, very.
Okay. Well, you know, if you follow the work I've done on my podcast shows, I've never cared about whether or not certain songs are either dated or from a certain, it sounds like it's from a certain time, you know, because to me, the only thing that matters is whether it's a good song and a good recording of it. And if something's a part of your life all the time, it doesn't sound dated, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that the only music that's worth listening to is what sounds contemporary today?
No, not at all. I didn't mean like that at all. It's not an insult to say that it doesn't. I wasn't insulting it. I'm just pointing out that it sounds a little dated. I love the Ebony and Ivory track, for example, but that also sounds very 80s and very. I mean, I don't think someone would record it like that today, unless they were deliberately trying to sound 80s, that kind of cheesy 80s thing. That's all I was trying to say. That I mean. I can listen. Revolver could be recorded today, but Sgt. Pepper, with all the trappings of all those psychedelic trappings, is 1967.
Right.
Yeah, that's all I was trying to say. But if it comes across as more insulting in the book, then I apologize.
No, it's more insulting to me because I get affected by that. We bring up this whole idea of music that sounds dated or of its time in almost every single show, and you know, it doesn't make a difference to me. Most of the music that's ever been recorded doesn't sound like it was recorded today. So you can't exclude that.
I borrowed a trick from Peter Doggett. I read a lot of his work, and when I was writing this book, and he says the book doesn't necessarily represent your personal views, but it has to represent the narrative. So maybe something that was perhaps the point I was trying to do to pinpoint the narrative. We'll get onto it later. You may ask me why is 33 1/3? Why do I say it's the weakest album? Well, I had to think of the narrative, and at some point, if I'm defending Dark Horse, then invariably I couldn't say every album is fantastic. And unfortunately, in this case, it was turned out to be 33 1/3, which has some very good songs on it, and I can enjoy but as a writer. One of the albums had to be seen as I had to make a case why one of the albums was weaker than the others, and this was it.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, you know, every time you praise something that George did, I'm right with you because I love most of his catalog. Obviously, some albums more than others, and Living in the Material World is my favorite album from any artist. You know.
It's a beautiful.
I could certainly understand people saying All Things Must Pass was his best album, but my personal favorite, the one that has touched me the most, has been Living in the Material World. And about that album, you said Harrison found himself feeling adrift from everything his peers expected of him. And you also say, in one way, Living in the Material World captures the songwriter more confidently than All Things Must Pass did. Without the many multitudes of instruments there to decorate the soundscape, the album's success now depended on Harrison's delivery, and it shows him delivering with more flexibility and ease than previously.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you're praising All Things Must Pass because of Phil Spector's production. Well, you got to give George credit along with Phil for the production. And here you are, the production was so much less. It was a much simpler production, with the exception of Try Some Buy Some, which Phil Spector co-produced. But you like it for that reason. You like it because it's simpler and more, I don't know if you want to call it stripped down, Be Here Now is as simple a production as you can make a song like Be Here Now. So.
Yeah, of course. I think it was very brave of George Harrison. I mean, I'm sure record execs in New York were like, what the hell? We're looking for the next, My Sweet Lord. Where is the next My Sweet Lord? It just wasn't there. But some songs like Light That Has Lighted the World, it just sung so beautifully. And when you said about the peers expected of him, I mean, in '73, McCartney's, he's jumping on the glam rock thing, and as is Ringo, and they're coming out with these rockers like Hi 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 or Back Off Boogaloo. George isn't doing that. He's doing something that isn't, glammy. It isn't very, pizzazzy, which is all over Britain. He's doing something that suits him, and it's work.
Well, I agree with you, but I like George. It doesn't matter who's producing him or if he produces himself. Because again, the songs matter first more than the production. But I love the production on this album too, and the musicianship. And he's always had great musicians. And John Barham is a quote from him about living in the material world in your book. George was under a lot of stress at the time of recording Living in the Material World. He was trying to match the success of All Things Must Pass, litigation over My Sweet Lord, and struggling marriage to Patty. You never know it from listening to the album, really.
No.
Although you got Sue Me, Sue You Blues in there, so you're talking about, the Beatles suing each other and all this.
Yeah. There's a lot of darkness to that album. Uncertain, there's great hope, but you also have The Lord Loves the One Who Loves the. It's a very convoluted title, and there's sort of a bitterness to that track as well. I think we're not quite at Dark Horse level of My Marriage Is Over, but the cracks are beginning to form on that album with the breakdown of marriage.
On Dark Horse.
On a Material World, the signs are there that the two of them either need to do something drastic or their marriage is going to fall apart.
Where do you sense that on the album? I'm just curious.
Lord, the Lord loves the one that loves the Lord. It's very, preachy, and if you don't follow my religion, I think in the book I compare it to Ian Paisley, who was known here in Ireland, although I'm not in Ireland right now, because he preached about how Catholics were awful, and the true religion was Protestantism, and it's that kind of level of venom. It's not the hopefulness of My Sweet Lord. It's a bit angrier. I'm not sure he would have written such a puerile track if his marriage was in a very happy place. There's none of that on the George Harrison album, where he has a kid and he's in a very happy place.
Okay. I wasn't hearing that in the song itself. I didn't hear anything that related to his personal problems with Patty, but you're saying he wouldn't have written a song like that if there weren't problems.
I don't think so. I mean, obviously the only person to ask is him, which is very hard to do. Considering. Okay, that was an insensitive joke. I'm sorry, but it's an educated guess of mine. When you spent a year listening to someone's work and you suspect there's nothing quite as angry as that on the George Harrison album. Even the Not Guilty track is quite upbeat and jolly. Because he's in such a happy place, he's got a son. He's with his soulmate. We don't get that in 1973. He doesn't have a child. He purportedly really wants a child. He can't have a child with Patty, and he's drinking. The drinking and the cocaine are starting to appear in his life, and I just think that exasperates, as is often the case with a lot of men. When there's something going on in your life, you just kind of punch through. You kind of force your habits and you force your hobbies down people's throats in a way that maybe you wouldn't if you were in a happier place. I know from my own experiences, there have been times where I may have like shouted things down at people when I'm going through some crap times in my life and not in jollier times of my life.
Okay, well, that's your interpretation, and it's definitely interesting. Something to consider there. I found it interesting that you said that "Who Can See It" is the closest thing on the album to a rock tune. And you said it was purportedly inspired by American tenor Mario Lanza.
Yeah.
Did George say that?
Yep.
Oh. Like, do you remember where that was? I'm gonna have to find a lot of these quotes from him.
Yes, I mean, I took the lazy way out and didn't put in the footnotes. I'll try and find that quote for you.
Okay. Well, with something like the title track, which rocks, for living in the
It rocks.
material world. And I think Don't Leave Me Way Too Long rocks a bit. You think Who Can See It is more of a rock tune than the others?
Probably more of a conventional rock tune than the others. I think it's the much of that album is very sparse and very acoustic based. I think Who Can See It is a bit more, although now that you say it, Material World is very kind of like Kashmir era Zeppelin. So it's probably a toss up between those two.
Okay. How much do you think the criticism that George got from the 1974 tour affected him?
I don't. I think it upset him, but I don't think it I'd say what affected him a bit more was the court case for My Sweet Lord. I think that really kind of dug into him. Because it's his greatest track, it's a signature track, and it's one that it's discredited. He's just because of a lawsuit, and Alan Klein purportedly was pulling strings from the other sides as a way of getting revenge, and it's his ultimate tribute to God. But suddenly, people are slamming it. Reportedly, George Martin even made a comment of, "Oh, a lot of George's songs sound like other people." I think that's the one that affected him a bit more as an artist.
Interesting, because it's apparent he never toured again after 74, except with Eric Clapton in 91. It could have just been the bad experience of touring, but I don't know about, because he was affected by the criticism as evident in This Guitar Can't Keep From Crying.
Yeah, I mean
Rolling Stones review, of the tour.
Yeah, I'd say it affected him somewhat. I think it's just the experiences of the tour probably were pretty. I mean, he himself said 74 was pretty. I say in the book that 74 was his annus horribilis. His marriage is finished. He's being asked a press conference about Eric Clapton walking off with his wife. The people aren't appreciating. He sees this as the next stage of world music, and people don't appreciate it. Audiences aren't responding the way he does. He has a temper tantrum on some of the stages. So I think the experience more so than the criticism. I don't think George was particularly bothered what papers wrote about him, or at least that's how he projected. I don't think any of the Beatles were that bothered as long as it wasn't too puerile. I think it was only when the likes of Peter Brown came forward and intimated stuff about Brian Epstein and John Lennon. I think that's when the Beatles started to take notice. I think before that they do the typical rock star thing. They don't read the papers.
All right, it's interesting, going back to when George was mixing the sitar with Beatles songs, and something as full blown as Within You Without You, or even Love You Too before that, a lot of people weren't accepting of it even then. That was just so
Out there.
Yeah, for a rock band to do that, and here it is many years later, and still a lot of people aren't catching on. But at the same time, the 74 tour, he had a lot of Ravi Shankar in there. He kind of forced it on everybody, much less the same way that John kind of forced Yoko on the public, and a lot of people couldn't take to that. So it's kind of similar in a way. I mean, I admire George for everything that he did in trying to incorporate all the Indian music that he did. I think it was brilliant. I think Within You Without You was one of the greatest recordings the Beatles ever made. And there are a lot of people who still don't get it. It's still way above their heads, you know, and here we are in 2022 talking about it. And there are a lot of fans that still don't really get it or really enjoy it, you know.
Yeah, I think my younger self in my teenage years didn't quite get the Indian stuff, but now as someone who tries to practice meditation, once this video is off, I'm going to try and do like half an hour of breathing and mindfulness before going to bed. I'm much more into that stuff now. I think the music and the stagecraft was brilliant, but for a lot of American fans who wanted to see a Beatle, this was very, very disappointing. And that's when I think Paul was happier to cater to that kind of market with Wings. You know, oh, this is one of my songs. I've just seen a face. Oh.
Yeah, but you know, Paul didn't rely on the Beatles in the 70s. He did everything he could. He just did 5 songs during the Wings Over America tour. And George wanted to do the same thing. He didn't want to have to rely on the Beatle name. You know, and that's understandable.
And he made some controversial.
Hmm?
He made some controversial changes to some of the lyrics.
Right.
Like in his life, I love him more.
In my life, yeah.
Lennon's great ode to, yeah.
A lot of the fans didn't take too kindly to that. All right. So tell me what your general feeling is about the Dark Horse album, because it's kind of, you got a mixed feeling about it, you know, from what I gather. What's that?
If you look down there at the bottom, kids, you can watch our video on Dark Horse.
I think there's a lot of really lovely songs on that album. Like So Sad is as close as confessional as we're going to get to the breakup of Patty and George. Simply Shady is rocking, and there's a lot of great riffs on that album, I think. But the vocals, yeah, I mean, there's a reason why the critics called it Dark Horse, more like Dark Horse.
Mm-hmm. I'm so used to it at this point, I don't even notice it really. I'm so used to George's vocals on the song Dark Horse, you know. And I actually went to see George in '74. The only time I ever got to see him in concert, and it was a disappointment for me, only because I couldn't really hear his vocals. I could hear the band really well, you know.
Yes.
And it was a terrific band. He always had.
I'm not jealous at all.
What's that?
I'm not jealous one bit.
Okay.
Not jealous.
All right, but you know, the Dark Horse album, to kick it off with Harry's on Tour, what a great instrumental. Really, you know, meant to be done live as he did. So yeah, and Maya Love is a great song as a live song too. It's a lot of really good stuff on there, I felt.
I agree. I just said the Paul McCartney thing of, oh yeah, yep. Because I'm quite jealous that you got to see George and I didn't. So I, as some of the viewers may see, I'm a tiny bit too young to have seen George live. But I mean, the live recordings that I've heard from are fantastic, and it's got Billy Preston, who's very spirited, and he's really, you know, helping his buddy out. With, you know, those soaring backing vocals, and yeah.
We're kind of losing your audio.
Yep.
I don't know if you could try to speak a little bit louder. I don't know if that'll make a difference.
Yeah, that's fine. So can you hear me now?
Oh, you're much better now.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I'm jealous of that you got to see him, but I've heard some of the live tracks, and yeah, I mean, the band sounded fantastic. Maybe George's vocals are a bit mousy, but otherwise, I mean, I wish I envy you so much that you got to see them in '74.
Hey, I still never got to see John. I saw 3 of the 4, but John's the only one I never got to see live. All right, just so everyone knows, we're not going to cover everything that's in the book because Owen's going to be a guest on one of my podcast shows, Talk More Talk, the solo Beatles videocast. So I always reserve, if I'm going to do more than one interview with someone, I always put aside some questions for the other interview. So it's just not a repeat of the previous interview, just so you folks know about that. But let's move on a little bit to Extra Texture, where you said George's vocal performance on You ranks among the best of his career.
Yep, I stand by that.
It's certainly hitting high notes there.
I mean, George wasn't a great singer, but he is pushing himself on that. It's one of the most demanding vocals of his career.
You do say in your book that, don't you kind of think of him more as a background singer?
Yeah.
Did I misinterpret that? Yeah.
No, I agree. I stand by that. Yeah, he was the third voice in the Beatles. He was, the backing vocals to Lennon and McCartney. But I mean, he could sing, and he could sing quite nicely too. And on occasion, he could like push himself, as he did on "Hear Me, Lord" or "You."
Yeah. Well, I think he's a great singer. He doesn't have the powerful voice that John has had or Paul has. And he's an incredible harmony singer, which I think he needs to be given a lot more credit for. And he has very distinctive vocals, which match his music. Sometimes the vocals are very strong and his range is widespread at times. Sometimes he's hitting high notes. And there are times when he has struggled a bit. Like I said, it's not the powerful vocals of John or Paul, but his voice it just suits his music. And sometimes I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, I think he did need a powerful backing vocalist like a Billy Preston or a McCartney on "I Want to Tell You" to, just kind of like give it an extra kind of push.
Mm-hmm.
But he's a fine singer. He sings much better than I can anyway. And I think I said in the book that I think Ronnie Spector's version of "Try Some Buy Some" is superior to George's, that he's not quite hitting the notes that she can.
Okay, well, I'm a little biased here. I prefer George's version, but I love Ronnie too. But it's a great song, and it's a very tough song to sing. It really is, because of the range that you need for something like that. Up at a very high register.
David Bowie murdered it. I mean, he didn't do it. I don't think he did a very good version.
Well, I'm very happy about the fact that he recognized the song to cover it. That's not one that people would cover, Whenever you're going deep and you're doing an album cut for many of the solo Beatles as opposed to a hit, there's plenty of My Loves and Imagines and Maybe I'm Amazes to go around. I really appreciate when they go deeper. And for David Bowie to recognize that, but he was familiar with Ronnie Spector's version, actually.
Yes, I believe that's true.
Yeah. We'll talk a bit about Extra Texture and we did in a previous show, but here you are writing, Extra Texture can be viewed as Harrison's pinnacle as a sound artist, a striking pillar of work that's every bit as impressive but less explosive than the production style Spector tailored for All Things Must Pass. You also write, there are moments of extraordinary lyrical beauty followed by portraits of raw, unvarnished nerves. There are pieces of explosive, uncontrollable anger and happier moments of quiet reflection.
Yes. Not bad, right?
No, not at all. Now, what you had said to me was, next to All Things Must Pass, you consider this the second best album. And I don't really know anyone other than you that feels that way. Not that there's anything wrong with that, because like I said, I like hearing different opinions. But I mean, in a nutshell, why do you feel so strongly about Extra Texture?
in one of the reviews for the book, one of the guys said this guy loves extra texture, which I can't fathom. So, I mean, and a couple of the Facebook comments have also been like, well, "What's with the love for extra texture?" I just think it sounds amazing. I think it really is. I mean, it really shows his flares, his versatility, his musical vibrancy. I was going to say genius. That's an overused term, but I'm going to say, yeah, his music genius. I mean, For You is so beautifully produced. The answer at the end, the barreling, His Name Is Legs track. There's so much variety, and he produced it all himself.
Yeah. I think I had said when you were on my show previously about extra texture that production-wise, to me, it kind of sounds like Phil Spector produced it. Not as heavily as All Things Must Pass, but it's closer in style, production-wise, to All Things Must Pass, much more so than Dark Horse is, and certainly Living in the Material World is.
Yeah, I can see that, but I mean, you could also make the point that Jeff Lynne's stuff, years to Phil Spector as well. I can hear a lot of Phil Spector and Jeff Lynne and Alan Parsons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and The Answers at the End, to me, is one of his best songs in his solo career, period. But, I don't know how many people appreciate His Name Is Legs the way you do. It's certainly one of his most unusual tracks, that's for sure. And you even say Legs Larry Smith does some improvisation in there. And I'm figuring there's a couple of lines in there that's him singing.
Yeah, I mean, it's George sings, and then you hear this voice, and it's Legs Larry Smith, and basically George just told him, "Go mad, just go for it."
Uh-huh. Well, it's definitely very comical, very much in a Monty Python way.
Yeah,
and
well, I mean, the Bonzos were close pals with Neil Innes, who was in the Bonzo Doodah band. Was considered the seventh Python because he did all the songs on Holy Grail and did some writing on the series that John Cleese left for.
Yeah, and I had a great time. I interviewed Neil Innes about a year before.
Stop trying to make me jealous.
He couldn't have been nicer, and anyone that wants to hear that, it's on my website. But did a lot of talking all about the Ruddles, and brilliant man with the songs he came up with. Let's see what else. You do say after Extra Texture, his music was getting more commercial. And at one point here, I think you were talking about the George Harrison album, where you were saying that it's probably his most effortless album at being commercial, even though he didn't really care about chart placement and how well it did. So do you think that there are times when George cared about his record sales and how well his albums did? I mean, let's face it, when Cloud9 came out, he gave a lot of interviews. So it must have mattered somewhat to him that he make some kind of a splash with the album. Everything was on his own terms. He did interviews when he wanted to, but you'd only give interviews if you're promoting the work and you want people to hear it.
Yeah. I mean, he wasn't like McCartney, who was, chasing number ones. I mean, even with Egypt Station, Paul reportedly very much wanted that to hit number one in the US, even though it's a fairly risible album. Did I just say that? I did. I think a lot of rock stars play this whole, yeah, man, I don't care what reviews or what the press thinks of me. I'm just do what I do, and that's a bit of a cliche. So unless I'm not a psychologist, I can't see behind the body language. He projected that image in '75. He certainly said, "Oh, I don't really care if nobody listens to my music." He did that even as early as '73 or in the early '70s. He said, "I don't care if nobody ever listens to me again." But I'm sure it meant something to him that he wouldn't go to all that work to put all these hours upon virtually a year of work if no one's going to listen to it. I mean, I didn't put a year of my life into a book. I would like some people to read it. Yeah. I mean, I don't expect to make a fortune from the book, but I would like people to read it.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult sometimes, and regardless of how much you study the four Beatles, you're never going to know everything there is to know about them. And sometimes I do feel like George is a tough person to figure out. I do believe that spirituality was something that was extremely important to him. We saw all these different sides of George, the guy that loves gardening, loves motor racing, loves Eastern philosophy, loves his family, his wife, his son, loves making music, loves Indian music, loves all kinds of music, country music, rockabilly, rock. There's so many sides to George Harrison, but there are times when he can be very serious and times when he could be hilarious. There's the side of him that loves Monty Python, and then there's the side of him that can be very preachy, and there are times when he wants to distance himself from the Beatles, and there are times when he embraces the Beatles. So how do you feel that George Harrison, the man, after all the studying that you've done and listening to all of his music?
I don't know if I understand myself, even though I've lived in my body for the best part of 29 years. So no, of course, I don't think I am, but I think I have a better overview of George after. He was all four Beatles were deeply complicated men. And they didn't like authors simplifying them. Mark Lewison has been on record on several podcasts saying that George could be quite difficult, and saying to him, "You weren't there, how would you know?" and stuff like that. It's right. Difficult to summarize any person as anything. We're humans are much more complicated than that. All you can do is give us as good a guess as you can.
Yeah, and there are a lot of podcasts where they try to figure the Beatles out. I try to figure the Beatles out. Very difficult to know the relationships that they had with each other. Some people like to think that they know more than everybody else, and it's very tough to know. And people make statements all the time that they can't prove. It's only their opinion. And so, I think that George was a beautiful person in a lot of ways, but like you said, I think all four Beatles are complicated. I think Ringo's the least complicated. But once you really study them more and more, you begin to realize there's things that you just don't know about them. I always like to bring up that line from "It's All Too Much." The more I learn, the less I know. The more that you take in knowledge-wise, the more that you realize there's so much you didn't know. And that certainly is the case these days when it comes to studying the Beatles and getting a documentary like Get Back, which is so eye-opening. You learn so much just from that alone, and it can break a lot of myths that you've been brought up on for so many years. So, I think all four Beatles are in their own way very fascinating, and George certainly is. And we only talked about half of the 70s here. And on my other podcast show, you're going to be returning fairly soon, and we'll probably go a little bit more in depth and certainly cover the second half of the 70s. But before we do, I do want to try to understand, and maybe I'm trying to figure out from all the interviews that I've done with you, you tend to prefer an artist when they're comfortable just being themselves, when they're not trying to ride whatever trends are going on at the time. So maybe in that regard, because you're not a fan of Cloud9, and Jeff Lynne was one of the hottest producers at that time. Is that part of the reason why you're not enamored of that album, when most Harrison fans would rate it very highly? Certainly, you always hear All Things Must Pass, Cloud9, and hopefully the fans know the catalog well enough where they can say, yeah, Living in the Material World, George Harrison, 33 and a Third, Brainwashed. There's great material on all those. But what is it about Cloud Nine? Why you're not that thrilled with that album?
Well, I mean, I actually quite like a lot of the ELO and a lot of Jeff Lynne's work, but he, as a producer, he can be very, very one note, a bit like Hugh Padgham can. I mean, on another podcast I was with you that Hugh Padgham often on his albums is always all that kind of stuff. But actually, I think the fault is with George. I just don't think he's putting his heart and soul into it in the way he did on other albums. I think the 80s as a whole for him as an artist, as a recording artist, wasn't a great decade for him. None of the albums stand up with the best of his 70s work. I think it wasn't until we get to Brainwash where he makes us an album that's as worthy as, say, a Living in the Material World or an Extra Texture. It's just too processed, too stadium rock. I mean, the fact that he gets Cloud Nine, the title track, is, it's just destined to be a stadium hit, even though he didn't do that much stadium work. He wasn't a stadium rocker. He released a stadium rocker in what year was it? It's a song he wrote with Tom Petty, Cheer Down. And again, I don't think it suited George. He didn't have that kind of hard rock voice. That I think Tom Petty would have done a better job of it. Like, I mean, with his rock voice, we've thin at your side. I think going back to what I said about George, I think he could struggle with the rockers or singing them. And some of the songs on Cloud Nine are just dreadful, like the Devil's Radio song. I said this on Hudson Ranny's podcast. I hate that song. I think it's awful. I think Hesperus, I don't think is a very good song. One day not one day at a time, just for a day. It's a bit hackneyed and cliched, and Shanghai Surprise is a dreadful song. So, I mean,
well, we certainly don't agree on a lot of things here. I mean, Devil's Radio, I think, is an out-and-out great rocker. And I was doing my radio show on the Beatles in New Jersey when Cloud Nine came out. Devil's Radio was probably the most requested song from the album. It really fit album rock radio at the time. You got Eric Clapton on there along with George, and Record the Hesperus was also a pretty. It was played a bit on the radio station I worked at the time, but yeah, it really fit certainly the sound of the time. And I know what you're saying about Jeff Lynne, because there's a certain style where he's producing it. A Jeff Lynne sound when you hear it. In most cases, but I think you could say that about a lot of producers. So,
I mean, that's something about George Martin, how versatile he was. He could just bring out the best of every artist. So he's producing America. He's getting, that sort of America sound, those, splashy, charming guitars. He's producing Jeff Beck. He makes it very rustic sounding. I mean, George Martin is seriously underrated as a producer. He just knew where everyone's strengths were and just brought them out.
I agree with you there. And as the Beatles themselves made so many changes and so rapidly, he adjusted to it all. It's a miracle they had him as their producer. Someone who really fit, who could mix comedy on a record, like on I Am the Walrus, all the great string arrangements that he added, even all the arrangements on the Indian instruments for Within You Without You. He was so brilliant in a lot of ways. But anyway, we're going to put this conversation to a close. And like I said, we're going to have you back on my podcast show, Talk More Talk, the Solo Beatles VIDEOCAST. That should be in about a week from now. So everybody who's watching this show, if you're a follower of that podcast, look out for that. The new book, once again, it's called Decades, George Harrison in the 70s, from Eoghan Lyng. And I'm sure you're going to get a whole bunch of other questions that I didn't ask here on the podcast show, but it's always a pleasure having you on, Eoghan. And anytime you want, knock on the door here, knock on the screen. and you can be a guest on the show. I'm not hearing you.
I put your name in the acknowledgement.
Yes, thank you for that. I really appreciate that as well. And all the other fellow podcasters that you put in there too. Okay, so thank you so much for being here again, Owen, and thanks to all of you for watching. Please subscribe to my channel. There's a lot more great interviews coming your way on Ken Michaels Radio. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.